Section 5 of Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy, Part 1, Chapter 5. The Listeners. When the expectant stillness consequent upon the exclamation had nearly died out of them all, an increasing light made itself visible in one of the windows of the upper floor. It came so close to the blind that the exact position of the flame could be perceived from the outside. Remaining steady for an instant, the blind went upward from before it, revealing to 30 concentrated eyes a young girl, framed as a picture by the window architrave, and unconsciously illuminating her countenance to a vivid brightness by a candle she held in her left hand, close to her face, her right hand being extended to the side of the window. She was wrapped in a white robe of some kind, whilst down her shoulders fell a twining profusion of marvellously rich hair, in a wild disorder which proclaimed it to be only during the invisible hours of the night that such a condition was discoverable. Her bright eyes were looking into the grey world outside with an uncertain expression, oscillating between courage and shyness, which, as she recognized the semicircular group of dark forms gathered before her, transformed itself into pleasant resolution. Opening the window, she said lightly and warmly, "Thank you, singers, thank you." Together went the window, quickly and quietly, and the blind started downward on its return to its place. Her fair forehead and eyes vanished, her little mouth, her neck and shoulders, all of her. Then the spot of candlelight shone nebulously as before. Then it moved away. "How pretty!" exclaimed Dick Dewy. "If she'd been raw waxwork she couldn't have been comelier," said Michael Mail. "As near a thing to a spiritual vision as ever I wish to see," said Tranter Dewy. "Oh, such I never, never see," said Leaf fervently. All the rest, after clearing their throats and adjusting their hats, agreed that such a sight was worth singing for. "Now to Farmer Shiner's, and then replenish our insides, father," said the tranter. "With all my heart," said old William, shouldering his bass viol. Farmer Shiner's was a queer lump of a house, standing at the corner of a lane that ran into the principal thoroughfare. The upper windows were much wider than they were high, and this feature, together with a broad bay window where the door might have been expected, gave it by day the aspect of a human countenance turned askance, and wearing a sly and wicked leer. To-night nothing was visible but the outline of the roof upon the sky. The front of this building was reached, and the preliminaries arranged as usual. "4 breaths, and number 32, behold the morning star," said old William. They had reached the end of the second verse, and the fiddlers were doing the up bow stroke previously to pouring forth the opening chord of the third verse, when, without a light appearing or any signal being given, a roaring voice exclaimed, "Shut up, Wully! Don't make your blaring row here. A feller wi' a headache enough to split his skull likes a quiet night." Slam went the window. "Hullo, that's a ugly blow for we," said the tranter in a keenly appreciative voice, and turning to his companions. "Finish the carol, or who be friends of harmony," commanded old William, and they continued to the end. "4 breaths, and number 19, said William firmly. "Give it him well. The choir can't be insulted in this manner." A light now flashed into existence. The window opened, and the farmer stood revealed as one in a terrific passion. "Drownen, drownen," the tranter cried, fiddling frantically. "Play fortissimy, and drown his spaking." "Fortissimy," said Michael Mail, and the music and singing waxed so loud that it was impossible to know what Mr. Shiner had said, was saying, or was about to say, but wildly flinging his arms and body about in the forms of capital X's and Y's, he appeared to utter enough invectives to consign the whole parish to perdition. "Very unseemly, very," said old William as they retired. "Never such a dreadful scene in the whole round of my carol practice, never! And he a churchwarden!" "Only a drap of drink got into his head," said the tranter. "Man's well enough when he's in his religious frame. He's in his worldly frame now. Must ask en to our bit of a party to morrow night, I suppose, and so put en in humour again. bear no mortal man ill will." They now crossed Mellstock Bridge, and went along an embowered path beside the Froom, towards the church and vicarage, meeting Voss with the hot mead and bread and cheese as they were approaching the churchyard. This determined them to eat and drink before proceeding further, and they entered the church and ascended to the gallery. The lanterns were opened, and the whole body sat round against the walls on benches and whatever else was available, and made a hearty meal. In the pauses of conversation there could be heard through the floor overhead a little world of undertones and creaks from the halting clockwork, which never spread further than the tower they were born in, and raised in the more meditative minds a fancy that here lay the direct pathway of time. Having done eating and drinking, they again tuned the instruments, and once more the party emerged into the night air. "Where's Dick?" said old Dewy. Every man looked round upon every other man, as if Dick might have been transmuted into one or the other, and then they said they didn't know. "Well now, that's what I call very nasty of Master Dicky, that I do," said Michael Mail. "He've clinked off home along, depend upon it," another suggested, though not quite believing that he had. "Dick!" exclaimed the tranter, and his voice rolled sonorously forth among the yews. He suspended his muscles rigid as stone whilst listening for an answer, and finding he listened in vain, turned to the assemblage. "The treble man too! Now, if he'd been a tenor or counter chap, we might have contrived the rest o't without en, you see, but for a quire to lose the treble, why, my sonnies, you may so well lose your—" The tranter paused, unable to mention an image vast enough for the occasion. "Your head at once," suggested Mr. Penny. The tranter moved a pace, as if it were puerile of people to complete sentences when there were more pressing things to be done. "Was ever heard such a thing as a young man leaving his work half done and turning tail like this?" "Never," replied Bowman, in a tone signifying that he was the last man in the world to wish to withhold the formal finish required of him. "I hope no fatal tragedy has overtook the lad," said his grandfather. "Oh no," replied tranter Dewy placidly. "Wonder where he's put that there fiddle of his. Why, that fiddle cost 30 shillings, and good words besides. Somewhere in the damp, without doubt. That instrument will be unglued and spoilt in 10 minutes. 10! Ay, 2. "What in the name of righteousness can have happened?" said old William more uneasily. "Perhaps he's drownded." Leaving their lanterns and instruments in the belfry, they retraced their steps along the waterside track. "A strapping lad like Dick dunno better than let anything happen unawares," Reuben remarked. "There's sure to be some poor little scram reason for it, staring us in the face all the while." He lowered his voice to a mysterious tone. "Neighbours, have ye noticed any sign of a scornful woman in his head, or such like?" "Not a glimmer of such a body. He's as clear as water yet." "And Dicky said he should never marry," cried Jimmy, "but live at home always, along with mother and we." "Ay, ay, my sonny, every lad has said that in his time." They had now again reached the precincts of Mr. Shiner's, but hearing nobody in that direction, one or two went across to the schoolhouse. A light was still burning in the bedroom, and though the blind was down, the window had been slightly opened, as if to admit the distant notes of the carollers to the ears of the occupant of the room. Opposite the window, leaning motionless against a beech tree, was the lost man, his arms folded, his head thrown back, his eyes fixed upon the illuminated lattice. "Why, Dick, is that thee? What bist doing here?" Dick's body instantly flew into a more rational attitude, and his head was seen to turn east and west in the gloom, as if endeavouring to discern some proper answer to that question, and at last he said, in rather feeble accents, "Nothing, father." "Th'st take long enough time about it then, upon my body," said the tranter, as they all turned anew towards the vicarage. "I thought you hadn't done having snap in the gallery," said Dick. Why, we've been traipsing and rambling about, looking everywhere, and thinking you'd done 50 deathly things, and here have you been at nothing at all. The stupidness lies in that point of it being nothing at all," murmured Mr. Spinks. The vicarage front was their next field of operation, and Mr. Maybold, the lately arrived incumbent, duly received his share of the night's harmonies. It was hoped that by reason of his profession he would have been led to open the window, and an extra carol in quick time was added to draw him forth. But Mr. Maybold made no stir. "A bad sign," said old William, shaking his head. However, at that same instant a musical voice was heard exclaiming from inner depths of bedclothes, "Thanks, villagers!" "What did he say?" asked Bowman, who was rather dull of hearing. Bowman's voice, being therefore loud, had been heard by the vicar within. "I said, thanks, villagers!" cried the vicar again. "Oh, we didn't hear 'ee the first time!" cried Bowman. "Now, don't for heaven's sake spoil the young man's temper by answering like that," said the tranter. "You won't do that, my friends!" the vicar shouted. "Well, to be sure, what ears!" said Mr. Penny in a whisper. "Beats any horse or dog in the parish, and depend upon't, that's a sign he's a proper clever chap." "We shall see that in time," said the tranter. Old William, in his gratitude for such thanks from a comparatively new inhabitant, was anxious to play all the tunes over again, but renounced his desire on being reminded by Reuben that it would be best to leave well alone. "Now, putting two and two together," the tranter continued, as they went their way over the hill and across to the last remaining houses, "that is, in the form of that young female vision we seed just now, and this young tenor-voiced parson, my belief is she'll wind en round her finger and twist the poor young feller about like the figure of 8. That she will so, my sonnies." End of section 5. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. The Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy, Part 1, Chapter 6. Christmas Morning. The choir at last reached their beds and slept like the rest of the parish. Dick's slumbers, through the 3 or 4 hours remaining for rest, were disturbed and slight, an exhaustive variation upon the incidents that had passed that night in connection with the school window going on in his brain every moment of the time. In the morning, do what he would, go upstairs, downstairs, out of doors, speak of the wind and weather, or what not, he could not refrain from an unceasing renewal in imagination of that interesting enactment. Tilted on the edge of one foot, he stood beside the fireplace watching his mother grilling rashers. But there was nothing in grilling, he thought, unless the vision grilled. The limp rasher hung down between the bars of the gridiron like a cat in a child's arms, but there was nothing in similes unless she uttered them. He looked at the daylight shadows of a yellow hue dancing with the firelight shadows in blue on the whitewashed chimney corner, but there was nothing in shadows. "Perhaps the new young school Miss Fancy Day will sing in church with us this morning," he said. The tranter looked a long time before he replied. "I fancy she will, and yet I fancy she won't." Dick implied that such a remark was rather to be tolerated than admired, though deliberateness in speech was known to have as a rule more to do with the machinery of the tranter's throat than with the matter enunciated. They made preparations for going to church as usual, Dick with extreme alacrity, though he would not definitely consider why he was so religious. His wonderful nicety in brushing and cleaning his best light boots had features which elevated it to the rank of an art. Every particle and speck of last week's mud was scraped and brushed from toe and heel. New blacking from the packet was carefully mixed and made use of, regardless of expense. A coat was laid on and polished, then another coat for increased blackness, and lastly a third, to give the perfect and mirror-like jet which the hoped-for rencounter demanded. It being Christmas Day, the tranter prepared himself with Sunday particularity. Loud sousing and snorting noises were heard to proceed from a tub in the back quarters of the dwelling, proclaiming that he was there performing his great Sunday wash, lasting half an hour, to which his washings on work-day mornings were mere flashes in the pan. Vanishing into the outhouse with a large brown towel, and the above-named bubblings and snortings being carried on for about 20 minutes, the tranter would appear round the edge of the door, smelling like a summer fog, and looking as if he had just narrowly escaped a watery grave with the loss of much of his clothes, having since been weeping bitterly till his eyes were red. A crystal drop of water hanging ornamentally at the bottom of each ear, one at the tip of his nose, and others in the form of spangles about his hair. After a great deal of crunching upon the sanded stone floor by the feet of father, son, and grandson as they moved to and fro in these preparations, the bass viol and fiddles were taken from their nook, and the strings examined and screwed a little above concert pitch, that they might keep their tone when the service began, to obviate the awkward contingency of having to retune them at the back of the gallery during a cough, sneeze, or amen, an inconvenience which had been known to arise in damp wintry weather. The three left the door and paced down Mellstock Lane and across the ewe-lease, bearing under their arms the instruments in faded green baize bags, and old brown music books in their hands, Dick continually finding himself in advance of the other two, and the tranter moving on with toes turned outwards to an enormous angle. At the foot of an incline the church became visible through the north gate, or church hatch as it was called there. 7 agile figures in a clump were observable beyond, which proved to be the choristers waiting, sitting on an altar tomb to pass the time, and letting their heels dangle against it. The musicians being now in sight, the youthful party scampered off and rattled up the old wooden stairs of the gallery like a regiment of cavalry. The other boys of the parish waiting outside and observing birds, cats, and other creatures till the vicar entered, when they suddenly subsided into sober churchgoers and passed down the aisle with echoing heels. The gallery of Mellstock Church had a status and sentiment of its own. A stranger there was regarded with a feeling altogether differing from that of the congregation below towards him. Banished from the nave as an intruder whom no originality could make interesting, he was received above as a curiosity that no unfitness could render dull. The gallery, too, looked down upon and knew the habits of the nave to its remotest peculiarity, and had an extensive stock of exclusive information about it, whilst the nave knew nothing of the gallery folk as gallery folk beyond their loud-sounding minims and chest notes. Such topics as that the clerk was always chewing tobacco except at the moment of crying Amen, that he had a dust-hole in his pew, that during the sermon certain young daughters of the village had left off caring to read anything so mild as the marriage service for some years, and now regularly studied the one which chronologically follows it, that a pair of lovers touched fingers through a knot-hole between their pews in the manner ordained by their great exemplars, Pyramus and Thisbe, that Mrs. Ledlow, the farmer's wife, counted her money and reckoned her week's marketing expenses during the first lesson. All news to those below were stale subjects here. Old William sat in the centre of the front row, his violoncello between his knees and 2 singers on each hand. Behind him on the left came the treble singers and Dick, and on the right the tranter and the tenors. Farther back was old Mail with the altos and supernumeraries. But before they had taken their places, and while they were standing in a circle at the back of the gallery practising a psalm or two, Dick cast his eyes over his grandfather's shoulder and saw the vision of the past night enter the porch door, as methodically as if she had never been a vision at all. A new atmosphere seemed suddenly to be puffed into the ancient edifice by her movement, which made Dick's body and soul tingle with novel sensations. Directed by Shiner, the churchwarden, she proceeded to the small aisle on the north side of the chancel, a spot now allotted to a throng of Sunday school girls, and distinctly visible from the gallery front by looking under the curve of the furthermost arch on that side. Before this moment the church had seemed comparatively empty. Now it was thronged, and as Miss Fancy rose from her knees and looked around her for a permanent place in which to deposit herself, finally choosing the remotest corner, Dick began to breathe more freely the warm new air she had brought with her, to feel rushings of blood, and to have impressions that there was a tie between her and himself visible to all the congregation. Ever afterwards the young man could recollect individually each part of the service of that bright Christmas morning, and the trifling occurrences which took place as its minutes slowly drew along. The duties of that day divided themselves by a complete line from the services of other times. The tunes they that morning essayed remained with him for years, apart from all others; also the text, also the appearance of the layer of dust upon the capitals of the piers, that the holly bough in the chancel archway was hung a little out of the centre; all the ideas, in short, that creep into the mind when reason is only exercising its lowest activity through the eye. By chance or by fate, another young man who attended Mellstock Church on that Christmas morning had, towards the end of the service, the same instinctive perception of an interesting presence in the shape of the same bright maiden, though his emotion reached a far less developed stage. And there was this difference too, that the person in question was surprised at his condition, and sedulously endeavoured to reduce himself to his normal state of mind. He was the young vicar, Mr. Maybold. The music on Christmas mornings was frequently below the standard of church performances at other times. The boys were sleepy from the heavy exertions of the night, the men were slightly wearied, and now, in addition to these constant reasons, there was a dampness in the atmosphere which still further aggravated the evil. Their strings, from the recent long exposure to the night air, rose whole semitones, and snapped with a loud twang at the most silent moment, which necessitated more retiring than ever to the back of the gallery, and made the gallery throats quite husky with the quantity of coughing and hemming required for tuning in. The vicar looked cross. When the singing was in progress, there was suddenly discovered to be a strong and shrill reinforcement from some point, ultimately found to be the schoolgirls' aisle. At every attempt it grew bolder and more distinct. At the third time of singing, these intrusive feminine voices were as mighty as those of the regular singers. In fact, the flood of sound from this quarter assumed such an individuality that it had a time, a key, almost a tune of its own, surging upwards when the gallery plunged downwards, and the reverse. Now this had never happened before within the memory of man. The girls, like the rest of the congregation, had always been humble and respectful followers of the gallery, singing its sixes and sevens if without gallery leaders, never interfering with the ordinances of these practised artists, having no will, union, power, or proclivity, except it was given them from the established choir enthroned above them. A good deal of desperation became noticeable in the gallery throats and strings, which continued throughout the musical portion of the service. Directly the fiddles were laid down, Mr. Penny's spectacles put in their sheath, and the text had been given out, an indignant whispering began. "Did ye hear that, souls?" said Mr. Penny in a groaning breath. "Brazen-faced hussies," said Bowman. "True, why they were every note as loud as we, fiddles and all, if not louder." "Fiddles and all," echoed Bowman bitterly. "Shall anything saucier be found than United Woman?" Mr. Spinks murmured. "What I want to know is," said the tranter, as if he knew already, but that civilization required the form of words, "what business people have to tell maidens to sing like that when they don't sit in a gallery and never have entered one in their lives? That's the question, my sonnies." "'Tis the gallery have got to sing, all the world knows," said Mr. Penny. "Why, souls, what's the use of the ancients spending scores of pounds to build galleries if people down in the lowest depths of the church sing like that at a moment's notice?" "Really, I think we useless ones had better march out of church, fiddles and all," said Mr. Spinks, with a laugh which to a stranger would have sounded mild and real. Only the initiated body of men he addressed could understand the horrible bitterness of irony that lurked under the quiet words "useless ones," and the ghastliness of the laughter apparently so natural. "Never mind, let 'em sing too, 'twill make it all the louder," said Leaf. "Thomas Leaf, Thomas Leaf, where have you lived all your life?" said grandfather William sternly. The quailing Leaf tried to look as if he had lived nowhere at all. "When all's said and done, my sonnies," Reuben said, "there'd have been no real harm in their singing if they'd let nobody hear 'em, and only jined in now and then." "None at all," said Mr. Penny. "But though I don't wish to accuse people wrongfully, I'd say before my Lord Judge that I could hear every note o' that last psalm come from 'em as much as from us, every note as if 'twas their own." "Know it? Ah, I should think I did know it," Mr. Spinks was heard to observe at this moment, without reference to his fellow players, shaking his head at some idea he seemed to see floating before him, and smiling as if he were attending a funeral at the time. "Ah, do I or don't I know it?" No one said "know what," because all were aware from experience that what he knew would declare itself in process of time. "I could fancy last night that we should have some trouble with that young man," said the tranter, pending the continuance of Spinks's speech, and looking towards the unconscious Mr. Maybold in the pulpit. "I fancy," said old William rather severely, "I fancy there's too much whispering going on to be of any spiritual use to gentle or simple." Then folding his lips and concentrating his glance on the vicar, he implied that none but the ignorant would speak again, and accordingly there was silence in the gallery, Mr. Spinks's telling speech remaining for ever unspoken. Dick had said nothing, and the tranter little, on this episode of the morning, for Mrs. Dewy at breakfast expressed it as her intention to invite the youthful leader of the culprits to the small party it was customary with them to have on Christmas night, a piece of knowledge which had given a particular brightness to Dick's reflections since he had received it, and in the tranter's slightly cynical nature party feeling was weaker than in the other members of the choir, though friendliness and faithful partnership still sustained in him a hearty earnestness on their account. End of section 6. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 1, Chapter 7. The Tranter's Party. During the afternoon unusual activity was seen to prevail about the precincts of Tranter Dewy's house. The flagstone floor was swept of dust, and a sprinkling of the finest yellow sand from the innermost stratum of the adjoining sandpit lightly scattered thereupon. Then were produced large knives and forks, which had been shrouded in darkness and grease since the last occasion of the kind, and bearing upon their sides "Sheer steel, warranted," in such emphatic letters of assurance that the warranter's name was not required as further proof, and not given. The key was left in the tap of the cider barrel instead of being carried in a pocket, and finally The tranter had to stand up in the room and let his wife wheel him round like a turnstile to see if anything discreditable was visible in his appearance. "Stand still till I've been for the scissors," said Mrs. Dewy. The tranter stood as still as a sentinel at the challenge. The only repairs necessary were a trimming of one or two whiskers that had extended beyond the general contour of the mass, a like trimming of a slightly frayed edge visible on his shirt collar, and a final tug at a grey hair, to all of which operations he submitted in resigned silence, except the last, which produced a mild "Come, come, Anne," by way of expostulation. "Really, Reuben, 'tis quite a disgrace to see such a man," said Mrs. Dewy, with the severity justifiable in a long-tried companion, giving him another turn round and picking several of Smiler's hairs from the shoulder of his coat. Reuben's thoughts seemed engaged elsewhere, and he yawned. "And the collar of your coat is a shame to behold, so plastered with dirt or dust or grease or something. Why, wherever could you have got it?" "'Tis my warm nature in summer time, I suppose. I always did get in such a heat when I bustle about." "Ay, the Dewys always were such a coarse-skinned family. There's your brother Bob just as bad, as fat as a porpoise, wi' his low, mean 'House do, Anne?' whenever he meets me. I'd house do him indeed. If the sun only shines out a minute, there'll be you all streaming in the face. I never see." "If I be hot weekdays, I must be hot Sundays." "If any of the girls should turn after their father, 'twill be a bad look out for 'em, poor things. None of my family were such vulgar sweaters, not one of 'em. But Lord a mercy, the Dewys! I don't know how ever I come into such a family." "Your woman's weakness when I asked you to join us. That's how it was, I suppose." But the tranter appeared to have heard some such words from his wife before, and hence his answer had not the energy it might have shown if the inquiry had possessed the charm of novelty. "You never did look so well in a pair of trousers as in them," she continued in the same unimpassioned voice, so that the unfriendly criticism of the Dewy family seemed to have been more normal than spontaneous. "Such a cheap pair as 'twas too, as big as any man could wish to have, and lined inside, and double lined in the lower parts, and an extra piece of stiffening at the bottom. And 'tis a nice high cut that comes up right under your armpits, and there's enough turned down inside the seams to make half a pair more, besides a piece of cloth left that will make an honest waistcoat. All by my contriving in buying the stuff at a bargain, and having it made up under my eye. It only shows what may be done by taking a little trouble, and not going straight to the rascally tailor's." The discourse was cut short by the sudden appearance of Charley on the scene, with a face and hands of hideous blackness, and a nose like a guttering candle. Why, on that particularly cleanly afternoon, he should have discovered that the chimney crook and chain, from which the hams were suspended, should have possessed more merits and general interest as playthings than any other articles in the house, is a question for nursing mothers to decide. However, the humour seemed to lie in the result being, as has been seen, that any given player with these articles was in the long run daubed with soot. The last that was seen of Charley by daylight after this piece of ingenuity was when in the act of vanishing from his father's presence round the corner of the house, looking back over his shoulder with an expression of great sin on his face, like Cain as the outcast in Bible pictures. The guests had all assembled, and the tranter's party had reached that degree of development which accords with 10 o'clock p.m. in rural assemblies. At that hour the sound of a fiddle in process of tuning was heard from the inner pantry. "That's Dick," said the tranter. "That lad's crazy for a jig. Dick, now I cannot, really I cannot, have any dancing at all till Christmas Day is out," said old William emphatically. "When the clock had done striking 12, dance as much as ye like." "Well, I must say there's reason in that, William," said Mrs. Penny. "If you do have a party on Christmas night, 'tis only fair and honourable to the sky folk to have it a sit-still party. Jigging parties be all very well on the devil's holidays, but a jigging party looks suspicious now. Oh yes, stop till the clock strikes, young folk. So say I." It happened that some warm mead accidentally got into Mr. Spinks's head about this time. "Dancing," he said, "is a most strengthening, alivening, and courting movement, specially with a little beverage added. And dancing is good. But why disturb what is ordained, Richard and Reuben, and the company generally? Why, I ask, as far as that do go?" "Then nothing till after 12, said William. Though Reuben and his wife ruled on social points, religious questions were mostly disposed of by the old man, whose firmness on this head quite counterbalanced a certain weakness in his handling of domestic matters. The hopes of the younger members of the household were therefore relegated to a distance of 1 hour and 3/4, a result that took visible shape in them by a remote and listless look about the eyes, the singing of songs being permitted in the interim. At 5 minutes to 12 the soft tuning was again heard in the back quarters, and when at length the clock had whizzed forth the last stroke, Dick appeared ready primed, and the instruments were boldly handled, old William very readily taking the bass viol from its accustomed nail, and touching the strings as irreligiously as could be desired. The country dance called "The Triumph," or "Follow my Lover," was the figure with which they opened. The tranter took for his partner Mrs. Penny, and Mrs. Dewy was chosen by Mr. Penny, who made so much of his limited height by a judicious carriage of the head, straightening of the back, and important flashes of his spectacle glasses, that he seemed almost as tall as the tranter. Mr. Shiner, age about 35, farmer and churchwarden, a character principally composed of a crimson stare, vigorous breath, and a watch chain, with a mouth hanging on a dark smile but never smiling, had come quite willingly to the party, and showed a wondrous obliviousness of all his antics on the previous night. But the comely, slender, prettily dressed prize, Fancy Day, fell to Dick's lot, in spite of some private machinations of the farmer, for the reason that Mr. Shiner, as a richer man, had shown too much assurance in asking the favour, whilst Dick had been duly courteous. We gain a good view of our heroine as she advances to her place in the ladies' line. She belonged to the taller division of middle height. Flexibility was her first characteristic, by which she appeared to enjoy the most easeful rest when she was in gliding motion. Her dark eyes, arched by brows of so keen, slender, and soft a curve that they resembled nothing so much as two slurs in music, showed primarily a bright sparkle each. This was softened by a frequent thoughtfulness, yet not so frequent as to do away for more than a few minutes at a time with a certain coquettishness, which in its turn was never so decided as to banish honesty. Her lips imitated her brows in their clearly cut outline and softness of bend, and her nose was well shaped, which is saying a great deal when it is remembered that there are 100 pretty mouths and eyes for one pretty nose. Add to this plentiful knots of dark brown hair, a gauzy dress of white with blue facings, and the slightest idea may be gained of the young maiden who showed, amidst the rest of the dancing ladies, like a flower among vegetables. And so the dance proceeded. Mr. Shiner, according to the interesting rule laid down, deserted his own partner and made off down the middle with this fair one of Dick's, the pair appearing from the top of the room like two persons tripping down a lane to be married. Dick trotted behind with what was intended to be a look of composure, but which was in fact a rather silly expression of feature, implying with too much earnestness that such an elopement could not be tolerated. Then they turned and came back, when Dick grew more rigid around his mouth. and blushed with ingenuous ardour as he joined hands with the rival and formed the arch over his lady's head, which presumably gave the figure its name, relinquishing her again at setting two partners, when Mr. Shiner's new chain quivered in every link, and all the loose flesh upon the tranter, who here came into action again, shook like jelly. Mrs. Penny, being always rather concerned for her personal safety when she danced with the tranter, fixed her face to a chronic smile of timidity the whole time it lasted, a peculiarity which filled her features with wrinkles and reduced her eyes to little straight lines like hyphens as she jigged up and down opposite him, repeating in her own person not only his proper movements, but also the minor flourishes which the richness of the tranter's imagination led him to introduce from time to time, an imitation which had about it something of slavish obedience, not unmixed with fear. The earrings of the ladies now flung themselves wildly about, turning violent somersaults, banging this way and that, and then swinging quietly against the ears sustaining them. Mrs. Crumpler, a heavy woman who for some reason which nobody ever thought worth inquiry danced in a clean apron, moved so smoothly through the figure that her feet were never seen, conveying to imaginative minds the idea that she rolled on casters. Minute after minute glided by, and the party reached the period when ladies' back hair begins to look forgotten and dissipated, when a perceptible dampness makes itself apparent upon the faces even of delicate girls, a ghastly dew having for some time rained from the features of their masculine partners, when skirts begin to be torn out of their gathers, when elderly people who have stood up to please their juniors begin to feel sundry small tremblings in the region of the knees, and to wish the interminable dance was at Jericho, when, at country parties of the thorough sort, waistcoats begin to be unbuttoned, and when the fiddlers' chairs have been wriggled by the frantic bowing of their occupiers to a distance of about 2 feet from where they originally stood. Fancy was dancing with Mr. Shiner. Dick knew that Fancy, by the law of good manners, was bound to dance as pleasantly with one partner as with another, yet he could not help suggesting to himself that she need not have put quite so much spirit into her steps, nor smiled quite so frequently while in the farmer's hands. "I'm afraid you didn't cast off," said Dick mildly to Mr. Shiner, before the latter man's watch chain had done vibrating from a recent whirl. Fancy made a motion of accepting the correction, but her partner took no notice, and proceeded with the next movement with an affectionate bend towards her. "That Shiner's too fond of her," the young man said to himself as he watched them. They came to the top again, Fancy smiling warmly towards her partner, and went to their places. "Mr. Shiner, you didn't cast off," said Dick, for want of something else to demolish him with, casting off himself, and being put out at the farmer's irregularity. "Perhaps I shan't cast off for any man," said Mr. Shiner. "I think you ought to, sir." Dick's partner, a young lady of the name of Lizzie, called Liz for short, tried to mollify. "I can't say that I myself have much feeling for casting off," she said. "Nor I," said Mrs. Penny, following up the argument, "especially if a friend and neighbour is set against it. Not but that 'tis a terrible tasty thing in good hands and well done. Yes, indeed, so say I." "All I meant was," said Dick, rather sorry that he had spoken correctingly to a guest, "that 'tis in the dance, and a man has hardly any right to hack and mangle what was ordained by the regular dance maker, who, I dare say, got his living by making 'en, and thought of nothing else all his life." "I don't like casting off, then very well. I cast off for no dance maker that ever lived." Dick now appeared to be doing mental arithmetic, the act being really an effort to present to himself in an abstract form how far an argument with a formidable rival ought to be carried, when that rival was his mother's guest. The deadlock was put to an end by the stamping arrival in the middle of the tranter, who, despising minutiae on principle, started a theme of his own. "I assure you, neighbours," he said, "the heat of my frame no tongue can tell." He looked around and endeavoured to give by a forcible gaze of self-sympathy some faint idea of the truth. Mrs. Dewy formed one of the next couple. "Yes," she said in an auxiliary tone, "Reuben always was such a hot man." Mrs. Penny implied the species of sympathy that such a class of affliction required by trying to smile and to look grieved at the same time. "If he only walk round the garden of a Sunday morning, his shirt collar is as limp as no starch at all," continued Mrs. Dewy, her countenance lapsing parenthetically into a housewifely expression of concern at the reminiscence. "Come, come, you women folk, 'tis hands across. Come, come," said the tranter, and the conversation ceased for the present. End of section 7. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 1, Chapter 8. They Dance More Wildly. Dick had at length secured Fancy for that most delightful of country dances, opening with 6 hands round. "Before we begin," said the tranter, "my proposal is that 'twould be a right and proper plan for every mortal man in the dance to pull off his jacket, considering the heat." "Such low notions as you have, Reuben! Nothing but strip will go down with you when you're a dancing. Such a hot man as he is!" "Well now, look here, my sonnies," he argued to his wife, whom he often addressed in the plural masculine for economy of epithet merely. "I don't see that. You dance and get hot as fire, therefore you lighten your clothes. Isn't that nature and reason for gentle and simple? If I strip by myself and not necessary, 'tis rather pot-housey, I own. But if we stout chaps strip one and all, why, 'tis the native manners of the country, which no man can gainsay. Hey, what did you say, my sonnies?" "Strip we will," said the 3 other heavy men who were in the dance, and their coats were accordingly taken off and hung in the passage, whence the 4 sufferers from heat soon reappeared, marching in close column with flapping shirt sleeves, and having, as common to them all, a general glance of being now a match for any man or dancer in England or Ireland. Dick, fearing to lose ground in Fancy's good opinion, retained his coat like the rest of the thinner men, and Mr. Shiner did the same from superior knowledge. And now a further phase of revelry had disclosed itself. It was the time of night when a guest may write his name in the dust upon the tables and chairs, and a bluish mist pervades the atmosphere, becoming a distinct halo round the candles; when people's nostrils, wrinkles, and crevices in general seem to be getting gradually plastered up; when the very fiddlers as well as the dancers get red in the face, the dancers having advanced further still towards incandescence and entered the cadaverous phase. The fiddlers no longer sit down, but kick back their chairs and saw madly at the strings, with legs firmly spread and eyes closed, regardless of the visible world. Again and again did Dick share his love's hand with another man and wheel round, then more delightfully promenade in a circle with her all to himself, his arm holding her waist more firmly each time, and his elbow getting further and further behind her back, till the distance reached was rather noticeable, and, most blissful, swinging to places shoulder to shoulder, her breath curling round his neck like a summer zephyr that had strayed from its proper date. Threading the couples one by one, they reached the bottom, when there arose in Dick's mind a minor misery, lest the tune should end before they could work their way to the top again and have anew the same exciting run down through. Dick's feelings on actually reaching the top, in spite of his doubts, were supplemented by a mortal fear that the fiddling might even stop at this supreme moment, which prompted him to convey a stealthy whisper to the far-gone musicians to the effect that they were not to leave off till he and his partner had reached the bottom of the dance once more, which remark was replied to by the nearest of those convulsed and quivering men by a private nod to the anxious young man between two semi-quavers of the tune, and a simultaneous "All right, aye, aye," without opening the eyes. Fancy was now held so closely that Dick and she were practically one person. The room became to Dick like a picture in a dream, all that he could remember of it afterwards being the look of the fiddlers going to sleep, as humming tops sleep, by increasing their motion and hum, together with the figures of grandfather James and old Simon Crumpler sitting by the chimney corner, talking and nodding in dumb show, and beating the air to their emphatic sentences like people near a threshing machine. The dance ended. "Faugh!" said tranter Dewy, blowing out his breath in the very finest stream of vapour that a man's lips could form. "A regular tightener, that one, sonnies." He wiped his forehead and went to the cider and ale mugs on the table. "Well," said Mrs. Penny, flopping into a chair, "my heart haven't been in such a thumping state of uproar since I used to sit up on old midsummer eves to see who my husband was going to be." "And that's getting on for a few years ago now, from what I've heard you tell," said the tranter, without lifting his eyes from the cup he was filling. Being now engaged in the business of handing round refreshments, he was warranted in keeping his coat off still, though the other heavy men had resumed theirs. "And a thing I never expected would come to pass, if you'll believe me, came to pass then," continued Mrs. Penny. "Ah, the first spirit ever I see on a midsummer eve was a puzzle to me when he appeared, a hard puzzle, so say I." "So I should have fancied," said Elias Spinks. "Yes," said Mrs. Penny, throwing her glance into past times, and talking on in a running tone of complacent abstraction, as if a listener were not a necessity. "Yes, never was I in such a taking as on that midsummer eve. I sat up quite determined to see if John Wildway was going to marry me or no. I put the bread and cheese and beer quite ready, as the witch's book ordered, and I opened the door and I waited till the clock struck 12, my nerves all alive and so strained that I could feel every one of 'em twitching like bell wires. Yes, sure. And when the clock had struck, lo and behold, I could see through the door a little small man in the lane, wi' a shoemaker's apron on." Here Mr. Penny stealthily enlarged himself half an inch. "Now, John Wildway," Mrs. Penny continued, "who courted me at that time, was a shoemaker, you see, but he was a very fair-sized man, and I couldn't believe that any such a little small man had anything to do with me, as anybody might. But on he came and crossed the threshold, not John, but actually the same little small man in the shoemaker's apron." "You needn't be so mighty particular about little and small," said her husband. "In he walks and down he sits, and oh my goodness me, didn't I fly upstairs, body and soul hardly hanging together. Well, to cut a long story short by long and by late, John Wildway and I had a miff and parted, and lo and behold, the coming man came. Penny asked me if I'd go snacks with him, and afore I knew what I was about almost, the thing was done. I fancied you never knew better in your life, but I mid be mistaken," said Mr. Penny in a murmur. After Mrs. Penny had spoken, there being no new occupation for their eyes, she still let them stay idling on the past scenes just related, which were apparently visible to her in the centre of the room. Mr. Penny's remark received no reply. During this discourse the tranter and his wife might have been observed standing in an unobtrusive corner, in mysterious closeness to each other, a just perceptible current of intelligence passing from each to each, which had apparently no relation whatever to the conversation of their guests, but much to their sustenance. A conclusion of some kind having at length been drawn, the palpable confederacy of man and wife was once more obliterated, the tranter marching off into the pantry, humming a tune that he couldn't quite recollect, and then breaking into the words of a song, of which he could remember about 1 line and a quarter. Mrs. Dewy spoke a few words about preparations for a bit of supper. That elder portion of the company, which loved eating and drinking, put on a look to signify that till this moment they had quite forgotten that it was customary to expect supper on these occasions, going even further than this politeness of feature, and starting irrelevant subjects, the exceeding flatness and forced tone of which rather betrayed their object. The younger members said they were quite hungry, and that supper would be delightful, though it was so late. Good luck attended Dick's love passes during the meal. He sat next Fancy, and had the thrilling pleasure of using permanently a glass which had been taken by Fancy in mistake, of letting the outer edge of the sole of his boot touch the lower verge of her skirt, and, to add to these delights, the cat, which had lain unobserved in her lap for several minutes, crept across into his own, touching him with fur that had touched her hand a moment before. There were besides some little pleasures in the shape of helping her to vegetables she didn't want, and when it had nearly alighted on her plate, taking it across for his own use, on the plea of waste not, want not. He also from time to time sipped sweet sly glances at her profile, noticing the set of her head, the curve of her throat, and other artistic properties of the lively goddess, who the while kept up a rather free, not to say too free, conversation with Mr. Shiner sitting opposite, which, after some uneasy criticism and much shifting of arguments back and forth in Dick's mind, he decided not to consider of alarming significance. "A new music greets our ears now," said Miss Fancy, alluding with the sharpness that her position as village sharpener demanded to the contrast between the rattle of knives and forks and the late notes of the fiddlers. "Ay, and I don't know but what 'tis sweeter in tone when you get above 40, said the tranter, "except in faith as regards father there. Never such a mortal man as he for tunes. They do move his soul, don't 'em, father?" The eldest Dewy smiled across from his distant chair an assent to Reuben's remark. "Spaking of being moved in soul," said Mr. Penny, "I shall never forget the first time I heard the Dead March. 'Twas at poor Corporal Nyman's funeral at Casterbridge. It fairly made my hair creep and fidget about like a flock of sheep. Ah, it did, souls. And when they had done, and the last trump had sounded, and the guns was fired over the dead hero's grave, a icy cold drop of moist sweat hung upon my forehead, and another upon my jawbone. Ah, 'tis a very solemn thing." "Well, as to father in the corner there," the tranter said, pointing to old William, who was in the act of filling his mouth, "he'd starve to death for music's sake now, as much as when he was a boy chap of 15. "Truly now," said Michael Mail, clearing the corner of his throat in the manner of a man who meant to be convincing, "there's a friendly tie of some sort between music and eating." He lifted the cup to his mouth and drank himself gradually backwards from a perpendicular position to a slanting one, during which time his looks performed a circuit from the wall opposite him to the ceiling overhead. Then, clearing the other corner of his throat, Once I was a setting in the little kitchen of the Dree Mariners at Casterbridge, having a bit of dinner, and a brass band struck up in the street. Such a beautiful band as that were. I was setting eating fried liver and lights, I well can mind, I was, and to save my life I couldn't help chawing to the tune. Band played 6/8 time, 6/8 chaws I, willy-nilly. Band plays common, common time went my teeth among the liver and lights as true as a hair. Beautiful 'twere. I shall never forget that there band. "That's as tuneful a thing as ever I heard of," said grandfather James, with the absent gaze which accompanies profound criticism. "I don't like Michael's tuneful stories, then," said Mrs. Dewy. "They are quite coarse to a person of decent taste." Old Michael's mouth twitched here and there as if he wanted to smile but didn't know where to begin, which gradually settled to an expression that it was not displeasing for a nice woman like the tranter's wife to correct him. "Well now," said Reuben with decisive earnestness, "that sort of coarse touch that's so upsetting to Anne's feelings is to my mind a recommendation, for it do always prove a story to be true. And for the same reason I like a story with a bad moral. My sonnies, all true stories have a coarse touch or a bad moral, depend upon't. If the storytellers could have got decency and good morals from true stories, who'd have troubled to invent parables?" Saying this, the tranter arose to fetch a new stock of cider, ale, mead, and home-made wines. Mrs. Dewy sighed and appended a remark, ostensibly behind her husband's back, though that the words should reach his ears distinctly was understood by both. "Such a man as Dewy is! Nobody do know the trouble I have to keep that man barely respectable. And did you ever hear too, just now at supper time, talking about taties with Michael in such a work-folk way? Well, 'tis what I was never brought up to. With our family 'twas never less than taters, and very often pertatoes outright. Mother was so particular and nice with us girls, there was no family in the parish that kept themselves up more than we." The hour of parting came. Fancy could not remain for the night because she had engaged a woman to wait up for her. She disappeared temporarily from the flagging party of dancers, and then came downstairs, wrapped up and looking altogether a different person from whom she had been hitherto. In fact, to Dick's sadness and disappointment, a woman somewhat reserved and of a phlegmatic temperament. Nothing left in her of the romping girl that she had seemed but a short quarter hour before, who had not minded the weight of Dick's hand upon her waist, nor shirked the purlieus of the mistletoe. What a difference, thought the young man, hoary cynic pro tem. What a miserable deceiving difference between the manners of a maid's life at dancing time and at others. Look at this lovely Fancy, through the whole past evening, touchable, squeezable, even kissable. For whole half hours I held her so close to me that not a sheet of paper could have been shipped between us, and I could feel her heart only just outside my own, her life beating on so close to mine that I was aware of every breath in it. A flit is made upstairs, a hat and a cloak put on, and I no more dare to touch her than... Thought failed him, and he returned to realities. But this was an endurable misery in comparison with what followed. Mr. Shiner and his watch chain, taking the intrusive advantage that ardent bachelors who are going homeward along the same road as pretty young women always do take of that circumstance, came forward to assure Fancy, with a total disregard of Dick's emotions, and in tones which were certainly not frigid, that he, Shiner, was not the man to go to bed before seeing his lady fair safe within her own door. Not he, nobody should say he was that. And that he would not leave her side an inch till the thing was done, drown him if he would. The proposal was assented to by Miss Day, in Dick's foreboding judgment, with one degree, or at any rate an appreciable fraction of a degree, of warmth beyond that required by a disinterested desire for protection from the dangers of the night. All was over, and Dick surveyed the chair she had last occupied, looking now like a setting from which the gem has been torn. There stood her glass, and the romantic teaspoon of elder wine at the bottom that she couldn't drink by trying ever so hard, in obedience to the mighty arguments of the tranter, his hand coming down upon her shoulder the while like a Naismith hammer. But the drinker was there no longer. There were the 9 or 10 pretty little crumbs she had left on her plate, but the eater was no more seen. There seemed a disagreeable closeness of relationship between himself and the members of his family, now that they were left alone again face to face. His father seemed quite offensive for appearing to be in just as high spirits as when the guests were there, and as for grandfather James, who had not yet left, he was quite fiendish in being rather glad they were gone. "Really," said the tranter in a tone of placid satisfaction, "I've had so little time to attend to myself all the evening that I mean to enjoy a quiet meal now. A slice of this here ham, neither too fat nor too lean, so, and then a drop of this vinegar and pickles. There, that's it, and I shall be as fresh as a lark again, and to tell the truth, my sonny, my inside has been as dry as a lime basket all night." "I like a party very well once in a while," said Mrs. Dewy, leaving off the adorned tones she had been bound to use throughout the evening, and returning to the natural marriage voice. "But Lord, 'tis such a sight of heavy work next day, what with the dirty plates and knives and forks, and dust and smother, and bits kicked off your furniture, and I don't know what all. Why, a body could almost wish there were no such thing as Christmases. Ah, dear!" she yawned, till the clock in the corner had ticked several beats. She cast her eyes round upon the displaced dust-laden furniture, and sank down, overpowered at the sight. "Well, I be getting all right by degrees, thank the Lord for it," said the tranter cheerfully through a mangled mass of ham and bread, without lifting his eyes from his plate, and chopping away with his knife and fork as if he were felling trees. "And you may as well go on up to bed at once, and not bide here making such sleepy faces. You look as long-favoured as a fiddle, upon my life, Anne. There, you must be wearied out, 'tis true. I'll do the doors and draw up the clock, and you go on, or you'll be as white as a sheet to morrow." I don't know whether I shan't or no." The matron passed her hand across her eyes to brush away the film of sleep until she got upstairs. Dick wondered how it was that when people were married they could be so blind to romance, and was quite certain that if he ever took to wife that dear impossible Fancy, he and she would never be so dreadfully practical and undemonstrative of the passion as his father and mother were. The most extraordinary thing was that all mothers and fathers he knew were just as undemonstrative as his own. End of section 8. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 1, Chapter 9. Dick calls at the school. The early days of the year drew on, and Fancy, having spent the holiday weeks at home, returned again to Mellstock. Every spare minute of the week following her return was used by Dick in accidentally passing the schoolhouse in his journeys about the neighbourhood, but not once did she make herself visible. A handkerchief belonging to her had been providentially found by his mother in clearing the rooms the day after that of the dance, and by much contrivance Dick got it handed over to him to leave with her at any time he should be near the school after her return. But he delayed taking the extreme measure of calling with it, lest, had she really no sentiment or interest in him, it might be regarded as a slightly absurd errand, the reason guessed, and the sense of the ludicrous, which was rather keen in her, do his dignity considerable injury in her eyes, and what she thought of him, even apart from the question of her loving, was all the world to him now. But the hour came when the patience of love at 21 could endure no longer. One Saturday he approached the school with a mild air of indifference, and had the satisfaction of seeing the object of his quest at the further end of her garden, trying by the aid of a spade and gloves to root a bramble that had intruded itself there. He disguised his feelings from some suspicious-looking cottage windows opposite by endeavouring to appear like a man in a great hurry of business, who wished to leave the handkerchief and have done with such trifling errands. This endeavour signally failed, for on approaching the gate he found it locked, to keep the children who were playing cross-stander in the front from running into her private grounds. She did not see him, and he could only think of one thing to be done, which was to shout her name. "Miss Day!" The words were uttered with a jerk and a look meant to imply to the cottagers opposite that he was now simply one who liked shouting as a pleasant way of passing his time, without any reference to persons in gardens. The name died away, and the unconscious Miss Day continued digging and pulling as before. He screwed himself up to enduring the cottage windows yet more stoically, and shouted again. Fancy took no notice whatever. He shouted the third time with desperate vehemence, turning suddenly about and retiring a little distance, as if it were by no means for his own pleasure that he had come. This time she heard him, came down the garden, and entered the school at the back. Footsteps echoed across the interior. The door opened, and 3/4 of the blooming young schoolmistress's face and figure stood revealed before him, a slice on her left-hand side being cut off by the edge of the door. Having surveyed and recognized him, she came to the gate. At sight of him, had the pink of her cheeks increased, lessened, or did it continue to cover its normal area of ground? It was a question meditated several hundreds of times by her visitor in after hours, the meditation after wearying involutions always ending in one way, that it was impossible to say. "Your handkerchief, Miss Day, I called with." He held it out spasmodically and awkwardly. "Mother found it under a chair." "Oh, thank you very much for bringing it, Mr. Dewy. I couldn't think where I had dropped it." Now Dick, not being an experienced lover, indeed never before having been engaged in the practice of love-making at all, except in a small schoolboy way, could not take advantage of the situation, and out came the blunder, which afterwards cost him so many bitter moments and a sleepless night. "Good morning, Miss Day." "Good morning, Mr. Dewy." The gate was closed, she was gone, and Dick was standing outside unchanged in his condition from what he had been before he called. Of course the angel was not to blame. A young woman living alone in a house could not ask him indoors unless she had known him better. He should have kept her outside before floundering into that fatal farewell. He wished that before he called he had realized more fully than he did the pleasure of being about to call, and turned away. End of section 9. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Beginning of part the second. Spring. Chapter 1. Passing by the school. It followed that as the spring advanced, Dick walked abroad much more frequently than had hitherto been usual with him, and was continually finding that his nearest way to or from home lay by the road which skirted the garden of the school. The first fruits of his perseverance were that, on turning the angle on the 19th journey by that track, he saw Miss Fancy's figure, clothed in a dark grey dress, looking from a high open window upon the crown of his hat. The friendly greeting resulting from this encounter was considered so valuable an elixir that Dick passed still oftener, and by the time he had almost trodden a little path under the fence, where never a path was before, He was rewarded with an actual meeting face to face on the open road before her gate. This brought another meeting, and another, Fancy faintly showing by her bearing that it was a pleasure to her of some kind to see him there, but the sort of pleasure she derived, whether exultation at the hope her exceeding fairness inspired, or the true feeling which was alone Dick's concern, he could not anyhow decide, although he meditated on her every little movement for hours after it was made. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. A meeting of the choir. It was the evening of a fine spring day. The descending sun appeared as a nebulous blaze of amber light, its outline being lost in cloudy masses hanging round it like wild locks of hair. The chief members of Mellstock parish choir were standing in a group in front of Mr. Penny's workshop in the lower village. They were all brightly illuminated, and each was backed up by a shadow as long as a steeple, the lowness of the source of light rendering the brims of their hats of no use at all as protection to the eyes. Mr. Penny's was the last house in that part of the parish, and stood in a hollow by the roadside, so that cart wheels and horses' legs were about level with the sill of his shop window. This was low and wide, and was open from morning till evening, Mr. Penny himself being invariably seen working inside like a framed portrait of a shoemaker by some modern Moroni. He sat facing the road with a boot on his knees and the awl in his hand, only looking up for a moment as he stretched out his arms and bent forward at the pull, when his spectacles flashed in the passer's face with a flash of flat whiteness, and then returned again to the boot as usual. Rows of lasts, small and large, stout and slender, covered the wall which formed the background, in the extreme shadow of which a kind of dummy was seen sitting, in the shape of an apprentice, with a string tied round his hair, probably to keep it out of his eyes. He smiled at remarks that floated in from without, but was never known to answer them in Mr. Penny's presence. Outside the window the upper leather of a Wellington boot was usually hung, pegged to a board as if to dry. No sign was over his door. In fact, as with old banks and mercantile houses, advertising in any shape was scorned, and it would have been felt as beneath his dignity to paint up for the benefit of strangers the name of an establishment whose trade came solely by connection based on personal respect. His visitors now came and stood on the outside of his window, sometimes leaning against the sill, sometimes moving a pace or two backwards and forwards in front of it. They talked with deliberate gesticulations to Mr. Penny, enthroned in the shadow of the interior. "I do like a man to stick to men who be in the same line of life, a Sundays anyway, that I do so. 'Tis like all the doings of folk who don't know what a day's work is, that's what I say. My belief is the man's not to blame, 'tis she. She's the bitter weed. No, not altogether. He's a poor Gorkhammer. Look at his sermon yesterday." "His sermon was well enough, a very good guessable sermon, only he couldn't put it into words and speak it. That's always the matter with a sermon, he hadn't been able to get it past his pen." "Well, ay, the sermon might have been good, for 'tis true the sermon of old Ecclesiastes himself lay in Ecclesiastes' ink bottle afore he got it out." Mr. Penny, being in the act of drawing the last stitch tight, could afford time to look up and throw in a word at this point. "He's no spouter, that must be said, I believe. 'Tis a terrible muddle sometimes with the man as far as spout do go," said Spinks. "Well, we'll say nothing about that," the tranter answered, "for I don't believe 'twill make a penn'orth of difference to we poor martels here or hereafter whether his sermons be good or bad, my sonnies." Mr. Penny made another hole with his awl, pushed in the thread, and looked up and spoke again at the extension of arms. "'Tis his goings on, souls, that's what it is." He clenched his features for Herculean addition to the ordinary pull, and continued. "The first thing he done when he came here was to be hot and strong about church business." "True," said Spinks, "that was the very first thing he done." Mr. Penny, having now been offered the ear of the assembly, accepted it, ceased stitching, swallowed an unimportant quantity of air as if it were a pill, and continued. The next thing he to do is to think about altering the church, until he found 'twould be a matter of cost and what not, and then not to think no more about it. True, that was the next thing he done. And the next thing was to tell the young chaps that they were not on no account to put their hats in the christening font during service. True. And then 'twas this, and then 'twas that, and now 'tis... Words were not forcible enough to conclude the sentence, and Mr. Penny gave a huge pull to signify the concluding word. Now 'tis to turn us out of the choir, neck and crop, said the tranter after an interval of half a minute, not by way of explaining the pause and pull, which had been quite understood, but as a means of keeping the subject well before the meeting. Mrs. Penny came to the door at this point in the discussion. Like all good wives, however much she was inclined to play the Tory to her husband's Whiggism, and vice versa in times of peace, she coalesced with him heartily enough in time of war. "It must be owned he's not all there," she replied in a general way to the fragments of talk she'd heard from indoors. "Far below poor Mr. Grinham," the late vicar. "Ay, there was this to be said for he, that you were quite sure he'd never come mum-budgeting to see ye, just as you were in the middle of your work, and put you out with his fuss and trouble about ye." "Never. But as for this new Mr. Maybold, though he mid be a very well-intending party in that respect, he's unbearable. For as to sifting your cinders, scrubbing your floors, or emptying your slops, why, you can't do it. I assure you I've not been able to empty them for several days, unless I throw 'em up the chimley or out of winder. For sure as the sun you meet him at the door, coming to ask how you are. And 'tis such a confusing thing to meet a gentleman at the door when you're in the mess of washing." "'Tis only for want of knowing better, poor gentleman," said the tranter. "His meaning's good enough. Ay, your parson comes by fate. 'Tis heads or tails, like pitch halfpenny, and no choosing. So we must take him as he is, my sonnies, and thank God he's no worse, I suppose." "I fancy I've seen him looking across at Miss Day in a warmer way than Christianity asks for," said Mrs. Penny musingly. "But I don't quite like to say it." "Oh no, there's nothing in that," said grandfather William. "If there's nothing, we shall see nothing," Mrs. Penny replied, in the tone of a woman who might possibly have private opinions still. "Ah, Mr. Grinham was the man," said Bowman. "Why, he never troubled us wi' a visit from year's end to year's end. You might go anywhere, do anything, you'd be sure never to see him." "Yes, he was a right sensible parson," said Michael. "He never entered our door but once in his life, and that was to tell my poor wife, ay, poor soul, dead and gone now, as we all shall, that as she was such a old aged person and lived so far from the church, he didn't at all expect her to come any more to the service, and was a very generous gentleman about choosing the psalms and hymns o' Sundays. 'Confound me,' says he, 'blare and scrape what ye will, but don't bother me.' And he was a very honourable man in not wanting any of us to come and hear him if we were all on end for a jaunt or spree, or to bring the babies to be christened if they were inclined to squalling. There's good in a man not putting a parish to unnecessary trouble. And there's this here man, never letting us have a bit of peace, but keeping on about being good and upright, till 'tis carried to such a pitch as I never see the like afore or since. No sooner had he got here than he found the font wouldn't hold water, as it hadn't for years off and on, and when I told him that Mr. Grinham never minded it, but used to spet upon his finger and christen him just as well, they said, 'Good heavens, send for a workman immediate. What place have I come to?' which was no compliment to us, come to that. Still, for my part, said old William, though he's arrayed against us, I like the hearty Boris Norris ways of the new parson. You ready to die for the choir, said Bowman reproachfully. To stick up for the choir's enemy, William. Nobody will feel the loss of our church work as much as I, said the old man firmly. That you'd all know. I've been in the choir, man and boy, ever since I was a child of 11. But for all that, 'tisn't in me to call the man a bad man, because I truly and sincerely believe en to be a good young feller. Some of the youthful sparkle that used to reside there animated William's eye as he uttered the words, and a certain nobility of aspect was also imparted to him by the setting sun, which gave him a titanic shadow at least 30 feet in length, stretching away to the east in outlines of an imposing magnitude, his head finally terminating upon the trunk of a grand old oak tree. "Maybold's a hearty feller enough," the tranter replied, "and will spak to you, be you dirty or be you clean. The first time I met en was in a drong, and though 'a didn't know me no more than the dead, 'a passed the time o' day. 'D'ye do?' he says he, nodding his head. 'A fine day.' Then the second time I met en was full buff in Town Street, when my breeches were tore into a long strent by getting through a copse of thorns and brambles for a short cut home along, and not wanting to disgrace the man by spaking in that state, I fixed my eye on the weathercock to let en pass me as a stranger. But no, 'How d'ye do, Reuben?' says he, right hearty, and shook my hand. If I'd been dressed in silver spangles from top to toe, the man couldn't have been civiller." At this moment Dick was seen coming up the village street, and they turned and watched him. End of section 10. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 2, Chapter 3. A turn in the discussion. "I'm afraid Dick's a lost man," said the tranter. "What? No," said Mail, implying by his manner that it was a far commoner thing for his ears to report what was not said than that his judgment should be at fault. "Ay," said the tranter, still gazing at Dick's unconscious advance, "I don't at all like what I see. There's too many of them looks out of the winder without noticing anything, too much shining of boots, too much peeping round corners, too much looking at the clock, telling about clever things she did till you be sick of it, and then, upon a hint to that effect, a horrible silence about her. I've walked the path once in my life, and know the country, neighbours, and Dick's a lost man." The tranter turned a quarter round and smiled a smile of miserable satire at the setting new moon, which happened to catch his eye. The others became far too serious at this announcement to allow them to speak, and they still regarded Dick in the distance. "'Twas his mother's fault," the tranter continued, "in asking the young woman to our party last Christmas. When I eyed the blue frock and light heels of the maid, I had my thoughts directly. 'God bless thee, Dicky, my sonny,' I said to myself, 'there's a delusion for thee.'" "They seemed to be rather distant in manner last Sunday, I thought," Mail tentatively observed, as became one who was not a member of the family. "Ay, that's a part of the sickness. Distance belongs to it, slyness belongs to it, queerest things on earth belongs to it. There, 't may as well come early as late, 's far as I know. The sooner begun, the sooner over, for come it will." "The question I ask is," said Mr. Spinks, connecting into one thread the two subjects of discourse, as became a man learned in rhetoric, and beating with his hand in a way which signified that the manner rather than the matter of his speech was to be observed. "How did Mr. Maybold know she could play the organ? You know we had it from her own lips, as far as lips go, that she has never, first or last, breathed such a thing to him, much less that she ever would play." In the midst of this puzzle Dick joined the party, and the news which had caused such a convulsion among the ancient musicians was unfolded to him. "Well," he said, blushing at the allusion to Miss Day, "I know by some words of hers that she has a particular wish not to play, because she is a friend of ours, and how the alteration comes I don't know." "Now this is my plan," said the tranter, reviving the spirit of the discussion by the infusion of new ideas, as was his custom. "This is my plan. If you don't like it, no harm's done. We all know one another very well, don't we, neighbours?" That they knew one another very well was received as a statement which, though familiar, should not be omitted in introductory speeches. "Then I say this," and the tranter, in his emphasis, slapped down his hand on Mr. Spinks's shoulder with a momentum of several pounds, upon which Mr. Spinks tried to look not in the least startled. "I say that we all move down along, straight as a line, to Parson Maybold's, when the clock has gone 6 to-morrow night. There we one and all stand in the passage. Then one or two of us go in and speak to un, man and man, and say, 'Parson Maybold, every tradesman do like to have his own way in his own workshop, and Mellstock Church is yours. Instead of turning us out neck and crop, let us stay on till Christmas, and we'll gie way to the young woman, Mr. Maybold, and make no more ado about it. And we shall always be quite willing to touch our hats when we meet ye, Mr. Maybold, just as before.' That sounds very well, eh?" "Proper well, in faith, Reuben Dewy." "And we won't sit down in his house. 'Twould be looking too familiar when only just reconciled. No need at all to sit down. Just do our duty, man and man, turn round and march out. He'll think all the more of us for it." "I hardly think Leaf had better go wi' us," said Michael, turning to Leaf and taking his measure from top to bottom by the eye. "He's so terrible silly that he might ruin the concern." "He don't want to go much, do ye, Thomas Leaf?" said William. He, no, I don't want to, only a teeny bit." "I be mortal afeard, Leaf, that you'll never be able to tell how many cuts to take to sharpen a spar," said Mail. "I never had no head, never. That's how it happened to happen." They all assented to this, not with any sense of humiliating Leaf by disparaging him after an open confession, but because it was an accepted thing that Leaf didn't in the least mind having no head, that deficiency of his being an unimpassioned matter of parish history. "But I can sing my treble," continued Thomas Leaf, quite delighted at being called a fool in such a friendly manner. "I can sing my treble as well as any maid or married woman either, and better, and if Jim had lived I should have had a clever brother. To-morrow is poor Jim's birthday. He'd have been 26 if he'd lived till to-morrow." "You always seem very sorry for Jim," said old William musingly. "Ah, I do. Such a stay to mother as he'd always have been. She'd never have had to work in her old age if he'd continued strong. Poor Jim!" "What was his age when 'a died?" 4 hours and 20 minutes. Poor Jim! 'A was born as might be at night, and 'a didn't last as might be till the morning. No, 'a didn't last. Mother called en Jim on the day that would have been his christening day if he had lived, and she's always thinking about en. You see, he died so very young." "Well, 'twas rather youthful," said Michael. "Now, to my mind, that woman is very romantical on the matter of children," said the tranter, his eyes sweeping his audience. "Ah, well, she might be," said Leaf. "She had 12. regular, one after another, and they all, except myself, died very young, either before they was born or just afterwards." "Poor feller too." "I suppose th'st want to come wi' us?" the tranter murmured. "Well, Leaf, you shall come wi' us, as yours is such a melancholy family," said old William rather sadly. "I never see such a melancholy family as that afore in my life," said Reuben. "There's Leaf's mother, poor woman. Every morning I see her eyes mooning out through the panes of glass like a pot sick winder flower; and as Leaf sings a very high treble, and we don't know what we should do without en for upper G, we'll let en come as a treat, poor feller." "Ay, we'll let en come, 'a believe," said Mr. Penny, looking up as the pull happened to be at that moment. "Now," continued the tranter, dispersing by a new tone of voice these digressions about Leaf, "as to going to see the parson, one of us might call and ask en his meaning, and 'twould be just as well done, but it will add a bit of flourish to the cause if the quire waits on him as a body. Then the great thing to mind is, not for any of our fellers to be nervous. So before starting we'll one and all come to my house and have a rasher of bacon. Then every man jack het a pint of cider into his inside. Then we'll warm up an extra drop with some mead and a bit of ginger. Every one take a thimbleful, just a glimmer of a drop, mind ye, no more, to finish off his inner man, and march off to Parson Maybold. Why, sonnies, a man's not himself till he is fortified wi' a bit and a drop. We shall be able to look any gentleman in the face then without shrink or shame." Mail recovered from a deep meditation and downward glance into the earth in time to give a cordial approval to this line of action, and the meeting adjourned. End of section 11. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK.